livro de Veena, que ela publicou em 95, com o nome de Critical Events, ela comenta que os esforços para pluralizar a antropologia, tanto no Ocidente quanto fora dele, não tinham tido sucesso até então. Apesar das exceções, a antropologia continuava predominantemente eurocêntrica. Eu creio que é nesse contexto que a ANPOCS convida Veena para participar desse encontro. E em nome da ANPOCS, tenho o prazer, então, de apresentar Veena, professora do Departamento de Sociologia da Universidade de Delhi, na Índia, e atualmente também professora da New School for Social Research de Nova York. Não vou me deter sobre a obra, eu acho mais eloquente do que qualquer comentário sobre a conferência, mas menciono apenas os últimos livros, mais ou menos alguns mais documentos centrados no estudo da violência, especialmente das interconexões entre a grande violência, os grandes espetáculos de violência e a vida cotidiana. Enfim, os 3 últimos livros, em 90, Mirrors of Violence, em 95, Critical Events, e o livro editado que saiu agora recentemente em 98, o nome de Social Suffering. Apesar de jovem, em 95, Veena recebeu da Academia Real Sueca a medalha Anders Versus, que premia o conjunto da obra do autor escolhido. Subsequentemente, a revista Etnos publicou um número especial em sua homenagem, em 96, com o título Culture and Voice. Apresento.
Let me start by saying what a great honor it is for me to be here. And especially, I want to thank ANPOCS for its generosity for bringing me here, and to Veena for many long years in which she has kept me literate about anthropology in Brazil. So the theme that I want to speak today is on boundaries, alterity, and everyday life. And there is an appearance of certain Wittgensteinian themes in the way in which I approach this theme. The last decade has seen the emergence of a new political geography, in which certain areas of the world are seen as inundated with political violence, in which identity politics, ethnic cleansing, and securing of territories through civic violence has played a major role. This has led to a return of attention to problems of boundaries and alterities. 30 years ago, when Frederick Barth introduced the theme of boundaries and identities, he thought of boundaries as ways of marking off one ethnic group from another. In his recent work, the concept of boundaries has become much more complex, suggesting that boundaries can be seen as linked with identities only in specific historical contexts. He suggests now that the concept of boundary may be unhitched from the question of distinction. More specifically, he suggests, pointing to Koch, that the bodily experiences of groups that live as nomads, for instance, leads them to order territories in ways that are different from that of sedentary groups. I want to take further the idea that our notion of boundaries is too strongly structured by territorial models. While there is something to be said for the impact of territorial boundaries on the structure of social relations, I believe we would make a mistake in thinking of boundaries as modeled only on territorial distinctions. Consider Wittgenstein's formulations that we draw boundaries all the time in everyday life and for many purposes. Fences are drawn, sometimes to keep people apart, and sometimes to jump over. Thus, in this paper, I am going to explore the theme of boundaries and alterations in the everyday life of families that had been the objects and subjects of traumatic violence during the partition of India in 1947. The violence between Hindus and Muslims that defined the event of the creation of the new border between India and Pakistan, I contend, needs to be understood as an event, a critical event, that moved over the terrains of state, region, neighborhoods, and families. In my earlier work, I have suggested that such critical events are critical precisely because they do not permit themselves to be understood within the existing scripts and repertoires that are available to social actors. I have also suggested in my book that on the one hand, the events of the partition were literally inscribed on the bodies of victims. On the other hand, there are no modes of representation which are available through which people could speak about these events. How was this violence then to be domesticated? How was everyday life to be remade in the face of such devastation? In order to understand this, we need to see how processes of hate and betrayal are represented and lived not only in the public sphere, but also in the density of relations within the family and within ties of locality and ties of kinship networks. We have recently seen in the case of former Yugoslavia how collective stereotyping seems how it created boundaries, and it seems to have released creating spirals of violence and cumulative experience that feeds selective hate further. Yet, it is also clear that stereotypes did not define fully the variation in the categories, concepts, and actions of people. For people also harbor other cognitive and experiential resources that can allow hate to be neutralized and new visions to be articulated. It is then with a certain sense of the importance of the creativity of everyday life, within which the political violence of larger entities resonates, that I think needs to be assimilated to our concept of politics. Hence, I turn to the family as an extremely important site on which to study the relation between critical events and everyday life. In this process, I hope to show how boundaries between speech and silence, saying and showing, may be crucial for understanding the alterity of the self. Like many other anthropologists compelled to write on violence, the glamour of terror, or the dismay of images, I have been caught in a scene of writing in which the moral urgency has far outpaced the capacity to render the violence intelligible. Yet, I want to reflect on this very poverty as a virtue. One may say of anthropology what Confere said of philosophy, that, I quote, the role of philosophical thought is to eliminate premature explanations, those limited positions which could prevent us from penetrating and possessing the formidable content of our being. This image of holding back also recalls, for me at any rate, Stanley Cavell's sketch of philosophy as that which does not speak first, its virtue lying in its responsiveness, tireless, awake when others have fallen asleep. And that's the image of anthropology that I would present to you. The image of wakefulness to the occurrence of violence, of the responsiveness to wherever it occurs in the view of life, leads many to ask whether acts of violence are transparent. How does one render the relation between possibility and actuality, and further, between the actual and the eventual? If violence, when it happens dramatically, as we have seen in the case of Yugoslavia, in the case of Rwanda, in several other kinds of cases, that it has a spectacular, dramatic quality. But if it bears some relation to what is happening repeatedly and unmelodramatically, then how does one tell this? Not in a single narrative, but in the form of a text that is being constantly revised, rewritten, overlaid with commentary. The word of time, not its image or representation, is what concerns me here. Finally, I lead up to an argument in which violence itself becomes divided between that which has the mode of being of work and that which has the mode of being of things, which is a Heideggerian distinction which I take further in this analysis. I tell you something briefly about the ethnographic context. When I was doing field work among urban Punjabi families in the early 70s and early 80s, some of whom had been displaced after the partition of India, and all of whom had to deal with the events of the partition in one way or another. The violence that they experienced was muted. As I have described in several earlier papers, the large political events were played in the register of the familiar through repeated engagement with what I have called poisonous knowledge. Hence, violence became like a poison that moved within the body of intimate relationships. In other words, the large political events in which new countries of India as a independent country and Pakistan as a new country was born, there was massive violence and displacement, which is comparable to the kind of violence that we have seen in Yugoslavia. It tore apart not only the countries, but also the local communities. It tore apart ties of friendship, and it even, I have argued, poisoned relationships within families as acts of betrayal cut through the fabric of the family. In other words, I'm suggesting that large political events not only mean that there are large ethnic groups which are pitted against each other, but also that there are numerous acts of betrayal and hate which begin to happen within the family and may therefore cut across the fabric of family ties itself. It was through the act of witnessing, I have argued, that this poisonous knowledge was transfigured into a recognition of the being of the other, thus constituting a knowing by suffering. Since my formulation owes something to Martha Nussbaum's examination of the Hellenistic ethics, one way to put the argument is in her words. I quote her, "There is a kind of knowing," says Martha Nussbaum, "that works by suffering, because suffering is the appropriate acknowledgement of the way human life, in these cases, is. Further, to grasp either a love or a tragedy by intellect is not sufficient for having real human knowledge of it. Amnon knows that Iphigenia is his child. If you remember, Amnon had agreed to the sacrifice of his daughter Iphigenia for political purposes. So Amnon knows that Iphigenia is his child for truth. If by this we mean that he has the correct beliefs, can answer many questions about her truly, etc. But because in his emotions, his imagination, and his behavior, he does not acknowledge the time, we want to join the chorus in saying that his state is less one of knowledge than one of delusion. He doesn't really know that she is his daughter. A piece of true understanding is missing. So violence is actualized over here, not only in the register of the familiar, but also in the grand events of political history, in the carnival character of collective violence, and in the sheer brutality of the styles of killing and raping. It is my sense that only the domestication of violence allows for the kind of work of healing that I had described earlier. I want to recall here one of the protagonists of two of my recent papers. I called her Asha. She was widowed at a young age. The potential for disorders of desire arose in her case within the family after the brutal disruptions of the partition. As she engaged with various betrayals, including those she suspected herself of, because, and this is a point I want to make, that no one lives through those kinds of massive violences without having some time or the other, oneself having betrayed something, some value or somebody that one loves. So as she engaged with these acts of betrayals, she broke the accepted norms of widowhood, but refused to live in bad faith, working through her intricate relations with women within her niche network, almost forcing a recognition among others towards the uniqueness of her being. So that in this case, the working with poisonous knowledge was not through an ascent towards godliness or renunciation. I mean, we often think that that the way out of betrayal, the way out of hate, is somehow to rise above the kind of human condition. I'm suggesting the opposite. I'm suggesting that in some ways it is by descending into everyday life that this kind of healing takes place. So that in this case she was disowned both by her native and her conjugal family for having broken the upper caste rules of remarriage, but she continued to try and repair the torn shreds of her relationships. Now let me mark at this point my difference from the work of many scholars on collective violence recently, such as Valentin Danner or Alan Feldman, who see agency primarily in the moments of resistance. Because from my own understanding, everyday life is not something which simply continues in an unthinking, unreflective way, as people like Schutz or Heller have suggested. I've suggested that it is in the kind of image of constant repair of relationships, in the way in which women repair torn shreds of clothes, that one might get an image of what it is to be able to maintain the everyday life in the face of this kind of violence. Now, in Punjabi families, stories of discord and betrayals and the narratives of violence between kin have to be managed very carefully on occasions of weddings, deaths, as well as gathering of kin. I think we all know that collective occasions are also occasions which are fraught with a lot of risk, because that which might be contained at the level of the local, at the level of the everyday life, can suddenly burst forth, and a lot of betrayals can be publicly displayed on occasions like weddings or deaths. And I'm sure many academics recognize that conferences are occasions of great danger in a similar kind of way. The interesting thing is that there is an enormous performative aspect to the way in which stories of betrayal and hate can be told. And yet, in relation to the violence of partition, there was always a certain kind of silence which surrounding these events. It is not that if asked, people will not tell a story. So if you ask them what happened during the partition, they can tell a story. But that story has none of the kind of performative aspects that stories in everyday life have. So I would argue that in this case, the stories have a kind of quality of frozen slides in the accounts of the violence of the partition. So in everyday conversations of the generations that left Lahore and came to India, there are references to everyday life, to the kind of food that was available there, to the sights of the sun and the sunrises and sunsets of Lahore, with a lot of intimate kind of appreciation. But if you ask someone about what happened during the partition, people will never tell a story about themselves. I mean, they may tell very general stories, but no one will ever say, this is what happened to me. Now, I think that this absence of spontaneous reference to atrocities done, witnessed, or suffered during the partition was simply not allowed to surface. And this is, by the way, a very great contrast in the way in which memory is articulated in the culture of Punjabi families from what you might be familiar from the study of Jewish families, in which there is almost an obligation to tell about the atrocities of the Holocaust. So that there are very interesting ways by which this kind of culture of storytelling and the culture of silences in fact structures memory of these events. So what is then the relation between the elaborate managing and staging of narratives that speak of violence, betrayal, and distrust within the networks of Egypt, and the thick curtain of silence pointing to its ordained presence? My next section is called Precarious Thresholds, and I use here the notion of the boundary as a threshold, but one which is a very precarious threshold. Writing on violence and narrative in Lebanon, Michael Gilson has written, I quote him, the rhetoric that life was a tissue of calculated performance, aesthetic elaboration of form, artifice, and downright lies, behind which one had to look for true interests and aims of others, was common to all. In this sense, a violence that was not physical coercion, but was of a more diffuse kind and integral to accounts of human relations, was common to all. I've also described in some earlier papers about the kind of uncertainty of relations which marks the everyday life in Punjabi families. And so there was a certain kind of sense in which, because of the danger of these public occasions, there was a sense that masculinity was the prudent management of public occasions through restraint. Yet the idea that life was a calculated performance and that one's honor had to be preserved by careful management of narratives about one's family in public spaces was indeed part of the rhetoric of life. So people would say, who has fought the tongue of people, one's honor is in one's own hands, and so on and so forth. Yet, such is the uncertainty of relations within families and within kinship groups that appear to have a solidity from the outside, that there is always a precarious balance around issues of honor and shame. And now I'm going to do what most anthropologists do. I'm going to tell you a story.